All right, with that being said, we're going to jump back into our sermon series called The Bible. We have been talking a little bit more specifically about the Bible. Of course, we talk about or from the Bible every week, but we're taking a different approach during this series. We want to know a little bit more depth about what does the Bible say, how did we even get the Bible, and then the books of the Bible, who wrote them, why were they written, what period of time were they written in, and then how can that apply to our life today. So last week, if you were here, Pastor Emily spoke about Ezra. And this week, we're going to continue that conversation by talking about Nehemiah. So I say continue because quite literally, Nehemiah is a continuation of Ezra. Previously, in the Hebrew Old Testament, Ezra and Nehemiah were the same book. They were one book. So they are the same story. They were later split into two books. So last week, Emily said Ezra wrote the book of Ezra. That's suggested. It's not 100% certain, but we're pretty sure Ezra wrote it. And he also would have written Nehemiah since they were one book. However, many of the details in Nehemiah are pretty personal to Nehemiah, so it's suggested that he probably helped Ezra with some of the writing. Ezra was also the author of 1st and 2nd Chronicles, and that was also previously one book, and then it was separated to be two different books. So that's a little background there. Who was Ezra? Ezra was a priest and a scribe, and the story of Ezra is largely about bringing back people from exile to Jerusalem. So last week, Pastor Emily described God's people had been in and out of relationship and in and out of sin versus being restored with God. So they would rebel, they would come back. They would sin, they would come back. And finally, God said enough, and he let the enemies of Israel take them captive. They took them exile. And this was a period of about 70 years, known as the Babylonian exile. And here we see Ezra bringing people back to Jerusalem. And his job was he rebuilt the temple. And so we talked about putting God back in his rightful place in the temple of Jerusalem, but also in our hearts. So if Ezra was all about rebuilding the temple, Nehemiah is all about rebuilding the walls around the city and around the temple so that it would be protected. And so who is this Nehemiah guy? Nehemiah was a cupbearer to King Artaxerxes, and that's where we pick up on his story. He was still in exile, so he had not yet come back to Jerusalem. He was still working for a foreign king in a foreign land. But he had made his way into a pretty good spot. He was the cupbearer, so he was in and out of the palace, making sure the king and his folks that worked with him had the drinks that they wanted. And he had a good relationship with him, and that's where we pick up on this story. So Ezra's doing his job, he's doing his thing, and he receives a message from back in Jerusalem. The message was, hey, the city is still in destruction, the walls are broken down. And he was really distressed by this. He did not like it at all. He was pretty upset, and he went into a period of mourning, and it says he went into a time of prayer and fasting. I want to back up one thing. I missed one thing. I wanted to point this out. So Nehemiah, as far as the context of Scripture goes, there's a period of time called the intertestamental period. And you say, what is that? Well, it's just like what it sounds like. We know there's two testaments, the Old and the New. There's a period of time in between those two. It's about 400 years where we don't see any recorded history of God's people. Nehemiah is actually the last recorded history that we see before the intertestamental period. It's not the last book in the Old Testament, but it's the last recorded history. So if you're wondering what goes on before Jesus comes, this is it. This is the end of that written history, and then we see Jesus come 400 years later. So that's that. Just want to get that out of the way before I forget. All right, so Nehemiah, he receives the news. Hey, the city's, the temple's rebuilt, but the walls are still, they're torn down. They're in rubble. The gates were burned. And so he goes into a period of mourning, of prayer and fasting, and finally he goes before the king, and the king has never seen him sad before. And he sees that he's sad, he's upset. The king says, what's wrong? What's going on? And so Nehemiah, he decides to go ahead and tell the king what's going on. We pick up on the story in chapter 2. If you've got your Bible, you can turn there. Chapter 2 in verse 3. So Nehemiah answers the king. He says, why should my face not look sad when the city where my ancestors are buried lies in ruins and its gates have been destroyed by fire? The king said to me, what is it that you want? Then I prayed to God, the God of heaven, and answered the king. I wanted to just stop right there for a second, as I thought that was a really cool detail that was included in this story. Sometimes we think about people in the Bible not as real people, just as people that lived whenever. Maybe they're just characters, but these are real people that had real experiences. And this moment, here he is, he's been praying and fasting for 4 months. Finally, the opportunity comes for the king to ask him what he wants. And he's like, he doesn't just say it. He prays to God. He stops, he pauses, and he prays. It's not like he went and walked off to his prayer closet and said, hold on, king, I'll be back in 20 minutes. I'm going to go pray. But it was one of those prayers that was like almost under his breath. Maybe a deep breath, God, help me. And so even in that moment, when he's about to make the big request, when he's about to make that big statement, he just breathes that breath out and says, God, help me. And that just, to me, reveals the human nature and helps me relate to some of the people. They experience the same stuff we experience. In that moment, he prayed to God. So he says, hey, king, if it pleases you, and if your servant has found favor in his sight, let him send me to the city in Judah where my ancestors are buried, so that I can rebuild it. And so the king grants him his request. He sends him back on his way. He gives him letters of approval. He also gives him letters that say, hey, you can take some supplies from the forest, different things that you're going to need to build the walls. And he's also sending him with troops and cavalry officers. So Nehemiah makes his way back to Jerusalem. When he gets there, the first thing he does is just settles in. He doesn't tell anybody why he's there, but he begins by inspecting the walls. And verse 13 kind of reveals some of what he does. It says, by night I went out through the valley gate towards the Jackal Wall and the Dung Gate, examining the walls of Jerusalem, which had been broken down, and its gates which had been destroyed by fire. So he takes a survey. He looks around. What's going on? What's broken? What's where are we at currently with the wall? And it's in pretty bad shape. The next thing is he gathers support. No one previously knew why he was there. But now he tells them, he says, hey, this is why I am here. This is what I've come to do. This is the vision that God has given me. And by the way, I've got support from the king, and he sent troops, and we're allowed to rebuild this wall. And so let's do this thing together. He casts the vision, he gathers support, and the people replied, let us start rebuilding. And so they began the good work. Now, right away, we pick up on the story, right at verse 19, right after that, we start with ridicule, and they're being mocked. Insults start to come. This guy named Sanballat is there with his crew. They're casting insults. What are you doing? Are you trying to rebel against the king? And so that opposition begins to building the wall. And then jump into chapter 3. Chapter 3 is all about the people who were involved in the building. So we read name after name and what sections of the wall that they were responsible for, who was helping them. You read through there, you see sons and daughters were helping. So pretty much everybody was involved. And it's a pretty cool record of history to be able to look at and say, oh, this family or this group of people rebuilt that wall or that gate. And it's a pretty cool thing. But not everybody was actually helping. There was one group of people that didn't help. And that's the only thing that really jumped out at me in chapter 3 is, wait a minute, why didn't these people not help them build the wall? And we see that in verse 5. Verse 5 says, the next section was repaired by the men of Tekoa, but their nobles would not put their shoulders to the work under their supervisors. So when I read this, it says they would not put their shoulders to the work. I'm wondering, why would they not do that? And I realized they wouldn't put their shoulders to the work to build the physical wall because they had already built a wall. Only their wall was around their heart. For whatever reason, their heart was hard to this project. I don't know if it was jealousy, right? Who's this Nehemiah guy? Just showed up 4 days ago, and all of a sudden everybody in the whole city is rallying around him. Were they jealous? I don't know what it was. Maybe they were bitter. Maybe they just thought they were too good. I'm not going to do the physical work. I'm a noble after all. But I don't know about you. I would not want my name recorded for all of history to be able to look back and say, those nobles, they were unwilling to do the work. That's not a good look. That's not what you want to do. So if God's put a vision in front of a group of people, get involved. Be involved in what God is trying to do. Do not be a noble. That's not a good look for you. All right, so chapter 4, we pick up. There's more ridicule coming. Sanballat's at it again. He's angry. He's greatly incensed. He's ridiculing them. They're insulting them. One of the guys says, hey, even if a fox climbed on that wall, it would fall down. So they're making fun of him. They're trying to get him off track. And then it escalates. We see in verse 8, not just verbally are they assaulting, but now they're threatening violence, right? Hey, they're going to stir up trouble against you. And so Nehemiah had to come up with a plan. What are we going to do? These guys are trying to harm us. So he comes up, he organizes some of the men. He says, hey, you're going to stand guard while they work. Then you can switch. Other men, you're going to hold a sword in one hand while you do the work with the other hand. And then he realizes, hey, we're pretty spread out here. There's a lot of vulnerability. The wall's pretty big. So what are we going to do if we get attacked? And so he says, hey, if you hear a trumpet blast, come to that place where the trumpet blast is, and that's where the attack is at, and we'll fight together, and God will fight for us. So he has some organization and develops a plan for that. Of course, the enemy is not done. He's still trying to deceive them. He's still trying to distract them. This time they decide, hey, let's send him a message. Let's get Nehemiah out of the city, come out to the plain where we can have a conversation. We just want to talk. It's okay. Just come on out. And Nehemiah realizes this is not a good idea. So he sends back and forth messages, back and forth. Hey, come out. Hey, no, I'm not going out. Hey, come out. Hey, nope, I'm not going out. This is very important work, he says. He realizes that they were scheming to harm him, and so he doesn't allow himself to be distracted. And along the way, again, we see him pray, God, strengthen my hands. Nehemiah is known as a man of prayer. You see, if you've read Nehemiah, you'll see time and time again, he spends time praying and asking God for help. Finally, he gets to the point where the attackers have now hired a man inside of the gate to try to intimidate him. And so the man inside the city says, Nehemiah, they're coming to attack you. Go into the temple, lock the door. That way they can't get to you. And he realizes that this would be wrong. Nehemiah, he says, I'm not going to do that. That would be a sin, and that would cause my name to be discredited and disgraced. And he realizes this man is actually a hired hand. And so he stands up against him and he says, no, I'm not going to do it. And finally, after 52 days, which is an incredibly fast period of time considering the vast nature of this wall, 52 days later, the wall was complete. And they had realized, the enemies had realized that these men had the help of God to complete the wall. And they were discouraged. They lost their confidence. And so we pick up then where Ezra comes back on the scene. We hear from Ezra again. He reads from the law. Everybody worships God, they confess sin, and they pledge again to follow the law. And if we skip ahead to chapter 13, we see Nehemiah had left the city of Jerusalem. He'd gone back to Artaxerxes. Artaxerxes had originally said, you can go, but I need you to come back. So he had gone back. And now we pick up on this story where he's returning once again to Jerusalem. So before he left, everything was good. The wall was complete. People were following the law. They were living for God. He leaves. He comes back later, and he finds out that some stuff was going wrong. And he was a little bit upset. By a little bit upset, I mean a bit upset. He was really upset. He finds that the temple was disgraced. The house of God was neglected. People were not honoring the Sabbath. Some had intermarried with women from other lands, and that was something specifically God said don't do. So he goes around. He starts setting them straight. He throws stuff out of the temple. He rebukes them. Verse 25 says that he rebukes them. He calls down curses on them. He beats some of them, and he pulls out their hair. I don't know about you, but that's pretty intense. Like ripping out some hair, you're really getting into it when you get to that point. But I think that's the level of commitment that he had and the hatred that he had towards sin. He hated it to the extent that he was willing to do that. I'm not saying we should do that, but that's one of the things he did. And it just shows, and the question has to be asked, do we get that upset about sin? Do we get that upset? That level of righteous anger, I just can't stand it. And sometimes I think we don't the way that we should. So in a nutshell, that's the story of Nehemiah. There's more to the story. If you haven't read it, I'd encourage you to read it. There's a lot of really good stuff in there. But in a snapshot, that's the story. Nehemiah rebuilt the walls. So what about our story? That's Nehemiah's story, but what about our story? How does that affect us? Well, I want to look at it from the perspective of the wall. If that's the main thing he did, he built a wall, what about us? What would we do with the wall? I mean, the thing is, in society today, we don't really build walls, right? I mean, at least not in this country. You're allowed to laugh. That's funny. Come on. I'm just kidding, guys. Just take a breath. All right, that's just a joke. You can laugh at that later. All right, so what does a wall do? Especially back then, a wall would protect stuff, right? It protects from attacks. It keeps things out, but it keeps other things in. It also marks a boundary. It says to people outside the wall, you can come up to here, but you can't come past here. And it says to those inside the wall, you can come to here, but if you go past the wall, then you're exposed to whatever it is that is outside the wall. So that's what a wall does. A wall also allows people to focus on other things. So while they were building the wall in Nehemiah's story, they were really consumed with that because they were worried about being attacked, right? So they had to keep an eye on things. They had to stay guarded. But once the wall was complete, the wall served to protect them, and now they could focus on other stuff. So that's what a wall does. So what would a wall look like for us in our life? Not a physical wall, but a spiritual wall. What if we took some of the steps Nehemiah took to put a spiritual wall around us? So last week, many of us took steps to put God back in his rightful place on the throne of our heart, right? That's what the story of Ezra was, to rebuild the temple, to put God back in his rightful place. We did that in our own life. God, we want you back where you belong. So Nehemiah built a wall to protect God in his temple. Not that God needs protected, but to protect the city, protect the temple. And so what if we build our own walls to protect what steps we took to put God back on his throne? And so what could this look like? Well, I think we need to understand what are some of the things in our life that potentially could take the place of God. And so I've got a few things up here, just some examples that I thought of. By no means is this an exhaustive list. You could probably think of your own examples of things that maybe could take the place of God in your life. The first thing on there is money and possessions. Because we know that sometimes it can be difficult, and we want to have money, and we can put our trust in money instead of putting our trust in God. But the Bible says you cannot serve both God and money. So we've got to figure out how we can guard against letting money take the place of God. And one of the antidotes to that is actually giving. When we give away stuff, when we give away money, we're saying, God, I trust you. You are my source. This money is not my protection. You are. And so the more we break that feeling of holding on to stuff and we actually give it away, that helps us keep God on our throne. So what would the wall be or the boundary be? The boundary might be, hey, I'm not going to go past 1 week, or I'm not going to go past one paycheck without giving something to God. Or I'm not going to go farther than 1 month without making an offering. And so that would be a boundary that you could put in your life. I'm not going to go past this far without doing something about that. When I was first out of the Marine Corps, I was living at home and went downstairs one morning, and the mail was there on the counter. And I saw the mail sitting there, and one envelope was from, I don't remember the organization, but a Christian organization that supplied the needs for people who were living in poverty around the world, right? Compassion International, one of those, whatever it was. And then I knew what that was. I don't need to look at that. I look around. There's another letter over here. It's addressed to me, and it's a stock statement, a financial statement from stocks that I owned. And I was pretty young. I was 24 at the time. But over the years, my grandmother had given grandkids money, and my parents just put it in stock because, a 7-year-old doesn't need money. So they just opened an investment account and let it build up. And so now I had taken possession of that account. And so I wanted to see what the account said, right? So I opened it up, almost $19,000, and I'm pretty pumped about that. And I'm singing this little song, I'm in the money. And so I put it back on the counter, and right away, I see this dotted line. It was definitely God speaking to me. Dotted line between that letter and the letter of that organization that wanted people to know God's love through providing physical food and support for them. And I thought in that moment, man, I think God's speaking to me. And I said, no, it's okay. I don't need to give all of it. That's fine. It's too much. I'm not going to give all of it. And I decided, okay, let me look at the letter. They wanted people to give goats and chickens, stuff like that. I'll give a couple goats, maybe a few chickens. Pretty nice gift, right? A couple $100, whatever. Feeling good about it. And then I go upstairs, taking a shower. In the shower, washing my hair. Used to have hair. Washing my hair. The radio's on, and I'm singing along with the radio. It's a Christian song, and I don't remember the line, but one of the lines says something like, I'll give you my everything. There's nothing between you and me, God. And I'm singing a song, and I mean it with all my heart. And in that moment, the light bulb goes off and said, oh, everything except that stock portfolio check. And I realized that I was holding on to money, and I was putting my faith in money and my trust in money more than I was in God. And so it took me a few days of praying and really coming to the determination of giving that all away, but I did. And I can point back to that moment as that moment of a step of trust and say, God, you are on the throne of my heart. Money's not where you belong. You're where you belong. And every time I've struggled, ever since then, I can point back to them and say, no, God's always been faithful. He's always taken care of me. And that's the point where I decided to put God on his throne, and that's where he's going to stay. So I would just encourage you, man, if you're struggling holding on to money, just let God speak to you. What does he want you to do? What does he want you to do? The cool thing is 3 days later, I'm driving in the car, listening to the radio. Haiti, if you know anything about Haiti, they experienced a really bad earthquake. A lot of people died. Really bad earthquake. And I heard on the radio an ad it was actually a newscast. They said, Compassion International, whatever it was, is on the ground in Haiti serving the needs of people. And God had already lined up people like me, probably thousands others, to give support to that organization because he knew that there was going to be a need. And so God's always at work. We just got to trust him. Trust him. Okay, so that's money. We'll move on. What else could take the place of God? Work. Some of you don't struggle with that, but if you're a workaholic, you know that the struggle is real. You can really struggle by replacing God, time with God, with work. But God himself actually put a standard in place, put a wall of protection in place. He said, you're not going to go more than a week without taking a day off. And now that I'm getting older, I recognize that I need that day off. When you're young, you don't really feel like you need to stop. You don't really need to rest. But the older you get, and if you're in this boat, you're old, you need to take time off. You've got to rest. This is God saying to you, I don't want you to get burnout. You need to be protected from burnout, from resentment. So take a day off. And so that would be our boundary. We're going to protect against resentment and burnout by putting a wall right here. We're not going to go past this far without taking time off. Technology and entertainment, right? We can easily allow stuff outside of, in the world, into our homes, into our minds, into our hearts through technology and entertainment. It's easy to do, right? It's so addictive. TikTok, all that kind of stuff, it's so addictive. But we got to be careful against that because we don't want that stuff to influence us in a negative way. So what could we do to put up a wall against that? Well, there's technology filters. Only certain things can come in through your internet stream. You might set up some form of maybe just cancel cable altogether. Maybe you don't want that at all. Or maybe you're going to agree, hey, we're going to utilize the rating guides that are out there. We're not going to watch rated R movies. That's something that Emily and I did when we were first married. Every Friday night was date night. We didn't have any money, so we walked down to the corner gas station to Redbox. It was back when it was only $1. We rent a movie for $1, but we quickly found out there's not that many movies that aren't rated R. And so we had to have a decision, what are we going to watch? And you know what? We just decided, if it's rated R, it doesn't matter what reason it's rated that way, we're just not going to do it. And so that's something that we decided early in our marriage. Fear. Fear can easily take the place of God. God said, do not fear. Do not be afraid. Put your trust in me. But fear can have a way of grabbing onto us, and it can easily take the place of God. The antidote to fear is faith. So if we have a struggle with fear, we might need to put some boundaries and some walls up that says, I'm not going to go past 60 seconds without praying. Hey, I'm dealing with this thought, this idea of fear. I'm not going to allow that, so I'm going to pray. Every time I have a thought, I'm going to pray. Every time I'm tempted to look at something on the internet or have a conversation with somebody about this fear that's not healthy, that's no longer allowed. I'm going to build a wall. I'm not going to do that anymore. I'm not going to allow that to take control of me. What about the opinions of man or women, but mankind, right? The opinions of mankind. And sometimes there's a lot of ways that we can be influenced by that, but social media is one of the big ones for today. And I especially want to throw this out there for parents in the room. If you've not looked at any of the research that has to do with teenagers and young adults being on social media, take some time and do that, because it's actually really scary, the influence that it's having on the youngest generation. And so God's put you in place to help put some walls up to protect them. Sometimes they don't recognize that they need protected, but that's why God's put you in their life to help them with that. But it's not just for teenagers, it's for everybody, right? We see stuff on social media where we're curious about stuff. We want to be cool. We want to be hip. And we start to let these other people influence us. Instead of God's opinion, we care about their opinion. And so we just need to be honest about that. We need to be honest about who is influencing us, and maybe we need to take some time away from that so we can recenter on what God's opinion is. Unhealthy relationships can really take place, to take God off of his throne. Our flesh says, I want that. That's selfishness. That's greed. And God said, no, you're made in my image. I'm not selfish or greedy, so that's not what I want you to do with your life. And so maybe you would need to put some walls up and say, hey, I'm never going to be alone with this person that I'm attracted to. Hey, I work with them, but guess what? We're always going to be in a work group. The doors are always going to be open. We're not going to be alone. Maybe a boundary would be, hey, I'm not going to go past a week, or I'm not going to go past 2 weeks without intentionally dating my spouse. I know that's one of the things that's difficult for Pastor Emily and me right now, because we're busy, right? We've got a lot going on. We've got kids, we've got jobs, we've got a house, we've got everything. But that's got to be one of the things that's a boundary in our life. We're not going to go past this far without specifically taking time to spend together, because when we do that, we're honoring God and keeping him in his right place. And then I have just sin, right? A lot of these things can be sin, but specifically sin. What is it that you're struggling with? Maybe it's spending. You're addicted, you're a shopaholic. You should not be addicted to anything. Whatever you're a slave to, whatever's mastered you, you should only be, the only master you should have is God. And so what would it be like for you to have some accountability with that? Maybe a trusted friend or family member come and take a look at your bank statement once a month. Hey, what are you doing with that? What's up with Amazon? All right, so those are just some of my ideas. I think a lot of those apply to us, but certainly you know your life. Think of your own. What applies to you? So what would we do? How would we start to put these walls in place? Well, I think we can go back to the story of Nehemiah. Nehemiah was a great leader. He was organized. He had a great vision for the wall, and he laid out a good example for us. The first thing he did was he prayed and he fasted. And I think that's a great place for us to start. Let's start by seeking God. God, what is it that you would have? What do you want me to do? Then he went and he surveyed the wall. So that might be a good place after you pray to start. Well, let's look around. What's working? What's not working? Where are we vulnerable? What do we need to approach first? Hey, this fence over here is doing a good job, but sometimes stuff hops over the fence, so we need a bigger wall. Maybe we need to do something different on this side. Okay, so start to survey. Where are we at currently, and how are we going to address those issues? And then Nehemiah, he rallied people around him. He got help. He didn't do it all on his own. There's no way a single person could build that entire wall. So he got help. And it says sons and daughters were part of that too. And so families, if you're here, yes, sons and daughters should be a part of that. They may go kicking and screaming, but they need to go into that conversation, help them understand what you're doing and why you're doing it. And I have on here, don't be a noble. So basically, what I mean by that is, let's say a husband or a wife goes to their spouse and says, hey, I really think we need to build a wall in this area of our life to protect the family. Don't be the one that says, we're good. I'm not putting my shoulder to the work. You just deal with it. No, we're in this thing together. Don't be a noble. Get involved in the work. Be a part of it. And then he created a plan specifically on how they were going to respond to threats. Nehemiah said, if you hear a trumpet blast, come, we're getting attacked, we need help. So what would you do in your life if you're trying to build a wall, but man, stuff keeps coming. Who are you going to call? What is your trumpet that you're going to blast? Who's going to come and help you? Maybe it's family members, maybe it's mentors, maybe it's people here at the church. Sometimes we need help. Don't be afraid to create a plan of what you're going to do in that situation. And then expect opposition. All throughout Nehemiah's story, people were coming. They're insulting him. They were threatening him with violence. They were trying to distract him. So we should expect the same thing as we're putting up these walls. Hey, if you tell someone at your family gathering, yeah, we canceled cable. There was some stuff coming on some of the channels that just wasn't honoring God. It was influencing us a little too much, so we just canceled it. Someone at the family gathering is going to say, what? You canceled cable? What? This is 2023. It's just TV. It's not hurting anything. What are you going to do with your kids? Just let them play? Like, what are you going to? There will be opposition. Expect it. But Nehemiah said, this is very important work. He didn't come out off the wall. He wasn't distracted. So we need to do the same thing. If God is speaking something to you that you need to do it. The next point is this: separation does not necessarily mean isolation. And I think that's a very important point. Sometimes, as Christians, we think if we can just build walls tall enough and wide enough and thick enough, we'll isolate ourselves enough from the world and we'll just be safe. We'll be fine. And that's not really how it works, but if we do that, we're also missing a very important part of what it means to be a Christian, and that's to have influence in the world. We are called to be separate from the world, right? Jesus wants us to be separated unto him. We should look different. We should act different. We should be different. We are different. But he also wants us to be salt and to be light. So we need to be in relationship. We need to have an ability to be out in the community, out in the world, and influence them. But what the wall does is it helps us do it on our terms. It helps us allow us to influence them and not them to influence us. And in the wall that Nehemiah built, but any wall, there are gates. There were lots and lots of gates that they put in, but we get to control the gate. Who goes in? Who goes out? What comes in? What goes out? We control the gate. We want God's presence in, right? That's always coming in. Come on in, God's presence, come on in. But no, we're shutting the gate on that one. We're not letting that in. So we got to recognize separation's good, but isolation is not good. We need to still be involved in what's going on. The last point is this: stay vigilant about what is happening inside the walls. Nehemiah set everything straight. He built the wall, he built the gates, he set all the people straight, they were doing what they were supposed to do, and then he left. But when he came back, he found out stuff was not going right. Now, don't pull anybody's hair out, right? But we've got to stay vigilant. We've got to make sure that we're watching what's going on, because stuff can happen inside the wall, so we've got to constantly reevaluate and look at what's going right, what's going wrong, how do we fix it? Stay vigilant. So our response today, what I would like us to do, is to do what Nehemiah did. The first thing he did was prayed. We recognize that through prayer, sacrifice, hard work, and tenacity, we can realize a God-given vision. But it starts with prayer. So I want us to do what he did. I want us to spend some time praying. God, what is it that you want for me? What does healthy look like? What is a God-given vision for your life, for your family, for your marriage, and for your walk with him? And as he begins to give you that, what does it look like for you? Start to allow the Holy Spirit to reveal to you what your wall situation is. Begin to survey the walls and ask God to reveal to you, hey, here is a vulnerable spot in your life. You need a wall there. Here is something that you need to address. You need something done over here. So allow that to happen this morning. And that's what I would like us to do. If Pastor Leah, if you'd come, and as she begins to pray, I just want us to take a couple of minutes. This doesn't end here. It starts here. But I want us to start by just allowing God to speak to us as individuals. And then we can take that and have a conversation. Take that and do what we need to do later. But let's begin today simply by asking God for what is a healthy vision for my life, and allow him to reveal to us some of the areas where we need some walls and we need to do something different. So if you would, just begin to pray, and I will close this out here in just a minute.
Your name is the highest, your name is the greatest, your name stands above them all thrones and dominions, all powers and positions, your name stands above them all. Your name is the highest, your name of powers and positions. Your name stands above them all, and the angels cry, holy. All creation cries, holy. You are lifted high, holy, holy forever. Hear your people sing, holy to the King of Kings. Holy, you will always be. Holy, holy forever. Your name is the highest. Your name is the greatest. Your name stands above them all. All thrones and dominions, all powers and positions. Your name stands above them all. Your name is the highest. Your name is the greatest. Your name stands above them all. All thrones and dominions, all powers and positions. Your name stands above them all, and the angels cry, holy. All creation cries, holy. You are lifted high, holy, holy forever. Hear your people sing, holy to the King of Kings. Holy, you will always be. Holy, holy forever. You will always be. Holy, holy forever.
God, we thank you that you are with us in this life. God, we recognize that you are holy. Help us to live a life that honors you, that resembles you, that separates us from this world. But God, help us to remember that you've called us to influence this world as well. I ask that you would be with your people, God, that you would open their hearts, open their minds to see things that they need to do, action steps that they need to take to help protect their kids, their homes, their families, their neighbors. God, help them to see clearly what you want them to see. I ask that you would strengthen them, and Lord, as distraction comes, that you would help them to stay focused on the work that you've called them to do. I thank you that you're strengthening them for today and for this week and for the days to come. I ask that you would bless them in the name of Jesus. Amen. Amen. Well, thank you guys for being here. God bless you and have a great week.